The 21-year-old Davis is charged with 9 counts of first-degree attempted murder, all stemming from a wild shootout with police 2 years ago.
Throughout this case, Davis has painted himself as a victim of corrupt police officers. He says he was a drug enforcer for rogue cops. He says he shot his way out of his sister's apartment only in self-defense.
Larry Davis became a symbol of resistance, a protest, fighting back.
Larry Davis is one of the wildest gangsters to ever come out of New York. Davis, also known as Loco Larry, was America's most notorious fugitive after he got into a wild shootout with the NYPD and lived to tell the tale. Larry started selling drugs from a young age, but after his pregnant girlfriend had a miscarriage due to crack, he decided he wanted out of the drug game. Larry then ran off on his plug for a large amount of money. The only problem was that Larry's plug was the New York City Police Department. As a young boy, Larry had been recruited into the drug game by crooked cops. They gave him drugs to sell, and it's said the crooked cops even made Larry rob and kill drug dealers for them too. But after Larry ran off with their money, the crooked cops were furious and decided that Larry had to go. It wasn't only that he ran off with their money, but he was also now a liability. Larry simply knew too much. However, there was another problem the crooked cops didn't know about. Larry knew the police were after him, and, despite only being 20 years old at the time, he wasn't gonna go down without a fight. So, when the cops came knocking at Larry's apartment door one winter day, in 1986, Larry was on the other side, ready for war. Larry then turned his little Bronx apartment into the last scene of Scarface, Say Hello to My Little Friend. But the only difference between Larry and Tony Montana was that, when the gun smoke cleared, Larry had shot 6 cops, before escaping into the night, uninjured, and now America's most wanted man. The shootout would make every major newspaper, as the entire country would soon hear about the 20-year-old drug dealer from the Bronx, who refused to bow down to the police. So, let's get straight into the story of Larry Davis, a certified savage. Larry Davis was born on May 28, 1966, the youngest of at least a dozen children. Larry's parents were originally from Georgia, and later relocated to the Highbridge section of the Bronx. Larry's father worked as a plumber, while his mother stayed at home to take care of the kids. Everything seemed normal, until Larry turned 10. When Larry was 10 years old, his father walked out on the family, leaving his mother to raise Larry and his siblings on her own. This would have been hard on any woman. But Larry's mother was different. With her husband now gone, it's said that she opened up her own store to provide for her kids. His mother was also well loved and respected in the neighborhood. A big reason why is because Larry's mother would look after the other kids in the neighborhood. If a kid came from a broken home or had no place to stay, Larry's mother would take them in and look after them. This, despite the fact that she was already a single mother, raising a dozen-plus kids of her own. This kindness may be explained by the fact that Larry's mother was a church-going woman. She would often bring Larry to church with her. Church would also be where Larry found his first real passion: music. As a young boy, Larry learned to play multiple instruments, including the piano and the organ. As he got older, he would even start his own recording studio and record label. This was at a time when most people didn't do things like that. In addition to music, Larry would also develop a real interest in motorcycles and cars. That's all to say that, from the outside looking in, Larry seemed like a normal kid in his early years. But beneath the surface, something was going on with him. After his father left, around the time he was in 5th grade, Larry would start getting into trouble. He would be kicked out of multiple schools, and quickly grew into a problem child. And things escalated quickly. By the time he was 14, Larry had dropped out of school, hitting the block full-time. Between 1980 to 1986, he was arrested numerous times for all types of crimes, ranging from robbery to violent offenses. Larry would quickly build a reputation for himself in the streets as someone who was violent, fearless, and crazy. There's even an urban legend that many people often tell about exactly how crazy Larry was. The story goes that Larry once tortured a chihuahua, killed it, and then cooked it in a skillet on the stove. Stories like this were the reason why Larry was given the nickname Loco Larry. And he really lived up to that name. During that same time period, between 1980 and 1986, Larry would be named as the prime suspect in at least 7 drug-related murders. That's right, as a teenager, police suspected Larry had up to 7 bodies. Larry's friends also knew that he was involved in some serious stuff. He would regularly get phone calls and visits from strange people. These strangers were often older, white men. When they called, Larry would tell everyone that he had to leave for a minute and that nobody else could come with him. When they would pay Larry a visit, they'd barge into his house, uninvited, and demand to speak to Larry, alone in another room. What was happening with Larry? How did he transform from that ordinary church-going kid into a full-blown savage? Everyone in America would find out the answer after police would show up to an apartment building in the Bronx on one cold night in November 1986. On November 19, 1986, at around 8:30 p.m., a group of 27 police officers descended on an apartment building in the Bronx. The address was 1231 Fulton Avenue. 15 of the officers started by surrounding the building, covering all exits, including the fire escapes and nearby alleyways. With the building now surrounded, the remaining 12 officers went inside through the front door. Once inside, 3 of them stayed back, while the 9 remaining officers shuffled to a unit on the first floor. The unit they had come to raid was Unit 1A. The unit was being rented by a woman named Regina Lewis. Lewis was living there with her husband and their 3 young children. But the police weren't there for them. The police were instead there, looking for Lewis's brother, Larry Davis. The police wanted to bring the then 20-year-old Larry in for questioning. 4 drug dealers had been found murdered in the Bronx, and Larry was the prime suspect in the case. At that time, he had been staying between his mom's house, his girlfriend's house, and his sister Regina's apartment. 3 days before the police came, Larry had showed up at his sister's home, unexpectedly, in the middle of the night. When his sister opened the door, she initially refused to let him in. She had been getting into arguments with her husband over Larry. Her husband didn't want Larry staying with them because Larry had been stashing drugs and guns at their apartment, the same apartment where their children lived. So, when Larry showed up that night, demanding to be let in, his sister initially said no. But, after his sister refused, Larry then slumped down in the doorway and began crying. This was something totally out of character for him. Larry then began telling his sister that nobody loved him and that everyone wanted to hurt him. His sister could also see that Larry was sweating heavily and that he had blood on his mouth. Something clearly wasn't right. Larry then pulled out a gun. He handed it over to his sister and begged her to put him out of his misery. His sister didn't know it at the time, but Larry knew that the police were after him. He knew that the police were blaming him for the quadruple murder and that they were out looking for him. Larry was terrified, but he never told his sister this. She then let him inside the apartment and Larry passed out on the couch. Fast forward 3 days later, and the police are now at his sister's front door. They had guns, and they were looking for Larry. The police also knew about Larry's reputation. Shortly before arriving at the apartment building that night, a message had been broadcast over the police radio, saying, "Use caution, he's crazy." 9 officers were now in front of Unit 1A, ready to go. But rather than knock and scream police, or just kicking in the door, the officers instead began turning the handle on the door, trying to sneak their way in. But, on the other side of the door, was Larry's sister. She noticed the door handle starting to turn. Curious, she got up and cracked open the door. Through the crack in the door, a voice then said to her, "Who lives here?" At the same time, her husband was also now paying attention. He got up and walked to the door. Looking through the crack in the door, her husband realized that the voice on the other side was the police. He then opened the door a little wider and began speaking to the officers. However, he was quickly interrupted when one of the officers screamed, "There he is." Larry was on the couch, now staring directly at the police in the doorway. Realizing it was the police, Larry jumped up and dashed down the back hallway into one of the back bedrooms. At the same time, 7 police officers rushed into the apartment, chasing after him. But what happened next is up for debate. There are 2 different stories of who shot first and who shot back in self-defense. According to Larry, after running into the back bedroom, he noticed his niece and nephew were in the room and quickly pushed them under the bed. A police officer, later identified as Ed McCarran, then burst into the room. McCarran shouted at Larry, asking him, "Where's the money?" Larry then told McCarran that he has the money, and please don't hurt my family. That's when, according to Larry, McCarran tried to shoot him in between the eyes. But Larry luckily leaned his head back, and the bullet only grazed his forehead. However, the force of the shot managed to drop Larry to the ground. Fearing for his life, Larry said that he then shot back at McCarran in self-defense. However, the police gave a different story of what happened after they had entered the apartment. According to the officer who was standing behind McCarran, Larry was alone in the back bedroom. The officers had been standing outside the room, and all heard Larry shuffling around inside, like he was looking for something. The police were also yelling at Larry to come out, with his hands up. Officer McCarran was the point man at the front. He then suddenly flew backwards in the air after Larry shot him in the face. The officers then fired back in self-defense.
He wasn't afraid. He just started shooting. I couldn't see the man to get a shot at him. I just kept firing to keep him away from me, and I imagine that's what everybody else was, just to keep him back. He was a lot of gunfire.
So you have Larry's story of who shot first, and the police's story. Larry said that the police were there asking him for money and trying to kill him. But the police say he was a violent criminal resisting arrest. Regardless of which one you believe, Larry and the 7 police officers were now in the middle of a ferocious gun battle. But even though he was clearly outnumbered, Larry wasn't outgunned. He had a shotgun and at least 2 handguns inside the back bedroom. Unfortunately for the police, Larry was heavily armed that day. For over 10 minutes, Larry would shoot it out with the police. Being outnumbered, you would think that Larry would come out on the losing end of the shootout. However, to everyone's surprise, Larry would injure 6 of the 7 cops, while not being seriously injured himself.
Here's a list of all the 6. 40-year-old Mary Buckley, shot in the mouth. 55-year-old John Ridge, treated and released last night. 42-year-old Donald O'Sullivan, who suffered a graze wound to the head. 46-year-old Thomas McCarran, shot in the neck. The most seriously injured, 26-year-old John O'Hara, shot in the face and may lose the sight in his left arm.
His accuracy was also ridiculous. 5 of the 6 cops he injured were all hit from the neck and up. Now severely injured, the 7 police officers retreated back into the hallway outside the apartment, leaving Larry alone inside. He then walked up to the front door and peeked into the hallway. Larry realized that he had just gotten into a shootout with a bunch of cops. So, he knew he had to get out of there, as it was only a matter of time before backup would arrive. And, to his luck, Larry noticed that the lock on the front neighbor's door had been blown open. Sensing an opportunity to escape, Larry then dashed across the hallway and pushed his way into the neighbor across the hall's apartment. Once inside, he ran to a window. Unlike many other apartment units, this unit's windows luckily had no burglar bars that could have prevented him from jumping out of it. Larry couldn't believe his luck. He then jumped out of the window into the rear courtyard. The rear courtyard was one of the only spots that the police hadn't bothered to station any officers. Once again, Larry couldn't believe his luck. He then jumped over a brick wall into a nearby alley and disappeared into the night. At 20 years old, Larry Davis had gotten into a one-man shootout with the police and managed to get away unharmed. Within hours, Larry Davis had become the most wanted man in America. The search for Larry was massive and even extended outside of New York City. In Albany, New York, every police cruiser had Larry's photo taped to the visor. Neighboring states were also put on alert. In nearby Illinois, Larry's physical description was broadcast to every state trooper at the beginning of every shift. In Baltimore, patrol officers were given 3 daily updates on the Larry Davis manhunt. Back in New York City, however, a $25,000 reward was placed on Larry's head. New York police also started a dedicated tip line where people could call in and give information about Larry's whereabouts. The phones rang off the hook, as police would receive over 1,000 calls per day and up to 100 calls an hour. New York police also put a dragnet on the city, locking everything down. Police conducted various raids, hitting up anybody they either knew or was affiliated with Larry.
The city's most wanted fugitive is still Larry Davis. For a week, police have been combing the city and conducting searches like this one of Davis's family's house. Today, the police department has nothing official to say about the search because such efforts are always conducted amidst tight security.
This made the streets so hot that many New York drug dealers actually said that they had to close up shop because of Larry. But each time the police conducted a raid, Larry would either not be there or somehow manage to escape. It got to the point that one police official said, quote, "He's like a cockroach. Every time you put your foot down, he sneaks away someplace else." End quote. Even the mayor of New York City, Ed Koch, would make a public appeal urging Larry to turn himself in, and promising that either a priest or minister would guarantee Larry's safe surrender. So, that leaves the only question. Where was Larry? Let's take a step back and consider Larry's situation first. Larry was only 20 years old at the time. He had now shot 6 New York police officers, and the entire NYPD was looking for him. Every single one of his friends and family members was also being monitored by the police, and he also didn't have the resources or sophistication to flee the country. Days had gone by since the November 19th shooting, and there was no sight of Larry. So, where was he at? Larry was right under the police's nose. Larry was hiding out with friends and family across the Bronx in Manhattan. He would switch up spots regularly, and sometimes even have to force people to help him at gunpoint. For example, he would later catch a kidnapping charge after he forced his friend's father to drive him somewhere while he was on the run. 5 days after the shooting, on November 24th, Larry would come out of his hole, calling ABC News in New York. He then asked to speak to a reporter, and told him the following, quote, "It's going to be dead or alive. And it's not going to be alive. They'll have to take me out through the morgue. Right now, I'm unstable. I don't know what I want to do right now. Everybody's looking for me. The first sight they see of me, they're going to kill me. They'll never find me. I'm hiding out." End quote. Larry was worried that the police were going to kill him before he had a chance to surrender. In particular, he was scared of a police officer nicknamed Crazy Joe, a police officer Larry had become familiar with before the shootout occurred, and a police officer who Larry believed would stop at nothing to kill him. On day 17 of the manhunt, Larry would show up at the Twin Peaks housing project. The housing project is located at 365 East 183rd Street in the Bronx. One of his other sisters lived there, and so Larry knew it was a place where he could lay his head, if only for a short while. However, Larry wasn't as low-key as he thought. Tips soon started pouring in, as people reported seeing Larry in the building. The police and media then rushed to the building and surrounded it. Police also called in helicopters above. Realizing Larry's sister lived there, police then rushed to her apartment, only to find it empty. Larry was one step ahead of them. Again, he had somehow known that police were on their way. A woman had been walking down the hallway with her 2-year-old son when Larry had approached her and demanded she help him. Scared, the woman agreed and took him up to the 14th floor. Once on the 14th floor, the woman knocked on the door to Unit 14EB. Another woman answered the door. Lifting up his shirt, flashing his gun, Larry then told the woman, "You know who I am. I'm Larry Davis." Having no choice, the woman then let Larry inside her apartment. She would later say that, when she initially opened the door, Larry had a look of fear and exhaustion on his face. He was safe, if only for a moment. Police had wiretaps up on the phones of all his relatives. They managed to overhear a conversation between two of Larry's relatives, which led them to believe that Larry was still in the building, despite the search of his sister's apartment coming up empty. While Larry was hiding out on the 14th floor, police then began a search of the entire 312-unit apartment building, one by one. Larry ordered the woman to shut all the lights off in the apartment. As everyone sat in darkness, the woman's husband would eventually come home from work. Her husband was terrified to find Larry in the house, and begged him not to kill his family. However, Larry told her husband, "Relax, I'm not here to hurt your family." After several hours, Larry would ask the woman's husband to go outside and do two things for him. First, he wanted her husband to call Larry's girlfriend and mother and tell them that Larry is okay. Second, he wanted the husband to grab some Chinese food. Fugitives gotta eat too. After the husband left, Larry was alone with the wife in the apartment. The wife began saying prayers for everyone, and this put Larry at ease. He then began telling the wife his story. But what Larry told her was shocking. Larry said that, as a young boy, he'd been recruited by the police to sell drugs. After his girlfriend had a miscarriage due to crack use, Larry then told the cops he wanted out of the game, and ran off with the crooked police officer's drug money. Remember, according to Larry's account of the shooting, the one cop came inside the back bedroom and asked where the money was. However, since Larry quit, he said the police wanted to kill him for both taking their money and also to tie up loose ends, because Larry knew too much about their dirty business. He would also tell the woman that, on the day of the shootout, that police were yelling racial slurs at him and had shot at him first. They were there that day to execute him, not to arrest him. Meanwhile, the woman's husband, still terrified that Larry would hurt his family, was on his way to get Chinese food. On his way out of the apartment, he walked up to a police officer and told them that Larry was in his apartment. With Larry's location now confirmed, it turned into a hostage situation. Larry would get into a day-long standoff with police. He told them that he had 2 guns and 2 grenades, and demanded that police give him a helicopter that would fly him to Washington, D.C. After 17 hours, Larry agreed to surrender, on the promise that the police wouldn't kill him. At 7:20 a.m., Larry stepped out of the apartment, shirtless, with his hands up. He was then cuffed. The hunt was over. As he was escorted out of the building, the crowd was chanting Larry's name. Larry then yelled the infamous line, quote, "It's a good thing to sell drugs." The cops gave me the guns." End quote. In less than 3 weeks, Larry Davis's name was ringing bells across the country. Now behind bars, he was facing dozens of charges, spanning 4 separate cases. The first case was the police shootout. For that case, Larry was charged with 9 counts of attempted murder, 6 counts of aggravated assault, 8 counts of criminal weapons possession, and 2 counts of criminal firearm use. The second case was the quadruple murder that police originally wanted to question him for. For that case, Larry was charged with 4 counts of second-degree murder, among other charges. The third and fourth cases were individual murder cases, in which Larry was allegedly the main suspect. While in pretrial custody, Larry also complained that he was being targeted by angry correctional officers, looking to hurt the alleged cop shooter. It got so bad that Larry had to be transferred from a state to a federal detention center in order to protect him from angry guards. The first case that Larry would go to trial for was the quadruple murder of 4 drug dealers. That trial would begin in December 1987. The prosecution called over 50 witnesses, including Davis's brother-in-law and sister. However, both said that the police had pressured them into saying that Davis was guilty. Prosecutors would also present fingerprints and ballistics evidence placing Larry at the scene. The defense instead argued that Larry had been framed and that the police were using this case to create a justification for entering the apartment the night of the infamous shootout. The defense also presented an alibi, saying that Larry was out in Virginia at the time of the murders. The trial would last until March 1988. The jury deliberated for 9 long days, the longest deliberation in Bronx history at that time. They would ultimately find Larry not guilty on all charges. Larry reacted by crying on his lawyer's shoulder, as his mother was heard screaming and praising Jesus.
The verdict was a stunning legal upset. Not guilty 16 times. Not guilty of murdering 4 reputed drug dealers. Not guilty of robbery.
But it was too early to celebrate. With 1 case down, Larry still had 3 to go. The next case would be for the infamous police shooting. The trial for the police shooting would be controversial from the start. Jury selection began in April 1988 and was tainted by claims of racism. Larry's defense attorney tried to have white people removed from the jury. Larry was a black man who had shot 6 police officers. His attorney worried that a mainly white jury would hear that and not understand what it was like growing up as a young black man in the Bronx, a place where police acted more like predators than the good guys.
It has become a racial tug-of-war, with accused cop shooter Larry Davis stuck in the middle. In the 12th day of jury selection, the prosecution has charged Davis's attorney William Kunstler with racism for purposely excluding whites from the prospective jury panel. In return, the defense charged the DA's office with excluding blacks.
The jury selection problem then caused 2 separate mistrials before the final jury was selected on the 3rd attempt. Larry was going to be tried by a jury of 10 black people and 2 Latinos. Larry's trial then began. From the first day, the courtroom was tense. The first 2 rows of the courtroom were packed with police in uniform who had come to show support for the injured police officers and to maybe intimidate Larry. Larry's friends and supporters were also in the courtroom to show their own support. The defense's strategy was simple. Larry's attorney wanted to argue self-defense. They were going to say that Larry only shot the police officers because they had come to his sister's apartment that day in order to kill him. In the packed courtroom, his defense attorney would say the following, quote, 24 police, all white, going there to talk to him. It had all the makings, to me, of a classic case of attempted assassination of a black kid they turned into a dope dealer. It just seemed like a perfect case, even though on the surface, it didn't seem like a Martin Luther King, a Stokely Carmichael. End quote. His lawyer then told the courtroom that the stories they were hearing about Larry in the news were misleading. The news had portrayed Larry as a violent drug dealer who had no respect for the law. However, Larry's attorney said that the truth was much different. The truth, instead, was that Larry had been recruited by crooked cops to deal drugs for them as a young boy. Things were going good until Larry's then-girlfriend had a miscarriage due to crack. Larry then wanted out of the drug game and told the police he was done. However, the cops wouldn't let him leave the game. Larry knew too much. But Larry said to hell with the police and disappeared with a couple $100,000, which the police had given to him in order to re-up. Having vanished with the crooked cops' re-up money and being a liability for knowing too much, the police then decided they had to take Larry out. That's when they came to his sister's apartment that November day and tried to assassinate him. However, Larry refused to die at the hands of the police. And so he fought back in self-defense. To support this version of events, Larry's attorney pointed to 3 key pieces of evidence. First, Larry had business cards and the telephone numbers of multiple police officers and detectives. How would a young black teen, with a long rap sheet, get his hands on such things? Larry's attorney said this proved that he knew the police officers, as Larry had been working for them as a drug dealer. Second, Larry's attorney pointed out the widespread corruption that was plaguing the NYPD at that time. For example, 13 police officers from Brooklyn's 77th precinct had been charged with corruption and drug dealing the year before. One of the officers who was arrested even admitted police corruption was common at that time, before he then took his own life. That officer's statement was further supported by another cop, named Michael Dowd. Dowd was described as New York's dirtiest cop, and would testify about police corruption at the Mullen Commission, a commission set up specifically to address New York's police corruption problem. The third and most important piece of evidence actually came from Larry's mother. A month before the police shooting, Larry's mother had filed a complaint against the police after they showed up at her home on Halloween 1986. That day, Larry's mother said the cops had forced their way into her home before one cop told her mom the following, quote, "You tell your son that he is going to get a bullet right in front of his forehead." End quote. As he was talking, the officer pointed his finger like a gun and was aiming it at Larry's mother's face. The incident rattled Larry's family at the time, but Larry's mother was smart enough to have reported it. So, while Larry was on trial and trying to argue that he shot the police in self-defense, he had evidence, in black and white, that clearly showed that the cops had in fact been threatening his life before the shooting. All because his mother had the foresight to file an official complaint. The case was then sent to the jury for deliberation. To find that Larry had acted in self-defense, the jury had to determine 2 things. First, did Larry reasonably believe that deadly physical force was about to be used against him by the police? Second, was that belief objectively reasonable? After 38 hours of intense deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. On November 20, 1988, Larry would be acquitted on all charges. After the verdict was read out, Larry's family and supporters erupted in the courtroom, shouting for joy and praising God.
You got just that face, God will just take you through it.
So do you think you're going to see your son at home then in the near future?
I believe that.
All right.
I believe.
New York City Mayor Ed Koch would respond by saying, quote, "I am shocked. Every policeman in New York, white, black, Hispanic, and Asian, must be horrified." End quote. Officer McCarran, the first cop that Larry shot that day, would also respond, saying, quote, "I think the jury should be ashamed of themselves. It was a racist verdict." End quote.
He beat us. Not only beat us that night, he just keeps beating us. I can't understand this guy.
One of Larry's defense attorneys, Lynn Stewart, would say something interesting. She would say, quote, "I really think that the black community is no longer going to have black Sambos. They're going to have black Rambos." However, although Larry was acquitted on all charges relating to the police shooting, he was convicted of 6 counts of criminal possession of a weapon for the guns he used that day. He would then be sentenced to 5 to 15 years on those weapons charges. But Larry still had 2 more cases to go. Those cases were for 2 separate drug-related murders, which Larry had been accused of. Larry would beat the first case in 1989. However, Larry's luck would eventually run out. In 1991, he would be convicted in the second murder case. Larry argued that the police had a vendetta against him and that they had pinned the murder on him. Because, if they couldn't get him on the police shooting case, they were going to find some other way. Larry was then sentenced to 25 to life. While serving his life sentence at the Shawanging Correctional Facility, Larry was stabbed to death following an argument with another inmate named Luis Rosado. Rosado, more infamously known by his nickname, Blue Boy, was a well-known gangster who was already serving life for murder. Blue Boy would later be released on parole and discuss the incident during an interview on Vlad TV. Despite coming from a decent home, Larry Davis would get caught up in the streets and become one of the most infamous gangsters in New York history. And, despite being hunted down by crooked cops, Larry would refuse to go down without a fight. As a result, Larry Davis's name rings bells across the city of New York till this very day. And that's why he's a certified savage. Please comment, like, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. More certified savages is on the way.